There is a specific feeling that arrives within seconds of being near moving water. A river, the ocean, a stream running through a park, even a fountain in a courtyard. Something shifts in the chest, in the breath, in the quality of attention. The shoulders drop a fraction. The breathing slows and deepens without any decision to slow or deepen it. The mind, which had been cycling through its catalog of concerns, loosens its grip on whatever it was holding. Most people assume this is psychological, a pleasant association with holidays, with childhood, with the aesthetics of landscape. What researchers have been measuring for the past 2 decades tells a different story. A set of specific, reproducible physiological changes in heart rate, in cortisol concentration, in brain wave frequency, in the electrical charge of the air itself that occur independently of mood, memory, or expectation. The feeling is in your blood chemistry, and the mechanism starts with the water itself, with what moving water puts into the air you breathe. There is a clinical trial from Columbia University showing that the air near a waterfall generates an effect on the brain indistinguishable from an antidepressant through a mechanism no one expected. The reason your body responds this way is older than language, older than memory, and it explains why the feeling arrives before the thought. Both come later. Start with the air. When water moves, when waves break against a shoreline and a river tumbles over rocks, when rain falls through open air, the mechanical energy of that movement does something specific to the water molecules at the surface. Droplets collide. The impact transfers kinetic energy to the molecular bonds, and some of those bonds break asymmetrically. Philip Lenard described this in 1892. When water droplets shatter on impact, the smaller fragments carry away a net negative charge, while the larger remnants retain a net positive charge. The electron transfer is a consequence of the surface energy dynamics of the collision. Smaller droplets have higher surface area to volume ratios, which favors the retention of excess electrons on their surfaces. The result is a cloud of negatively charged water molecules, negative air ions, dispersing into the surrounding atmosphere from every point where water is in turbulent motion. Concentrations vary by environment, and the variation is enormous. A waterfall generates between 10,000 and 50,000 negative ions per cubic centimeter of air. Ocean surf along a shoreline generates 10,000 to 20,000 within the spray zone. A fast-flowing mountain stream generates roughly 5,000. A gentle rain generates 1,000 to 5,000 depending on drop size and velocity. Indoor air, the air in your living room, your office, the supermarket, typically contains 100 to 200 negative ions per cubic centimeter. Standing beside a waterfall, you are breathing air that carries 200 to 500 times the electrical charge of the air in your kitchen. The difference is not a subtle enhancement. It is a fundamentally different chemical environment entering your lungs with every breath. Every breath near moving water carries negative ions into the lungs in concentrations that indoor air cannot approach. The difference is measurable with an ion counter, a standard instrument in atmospheric physics, and reproducible across every moving water environment tested. The physics is mechanical. Moving water generates charged air. The concentration depends on the violence of the movement. The more turbulent the water, the more droplets shatter, the more electrons transfer, the higher the ion density. A placid lake generates almost nothing. A crashing wave generates tens of thousands per cubic centimeter. The feeling you get near a waterfall that you do not get near a still pond is, in part, the difference in the electrical composition of the air entering your lungs. What do those ions do once they are inside? Negative ions enter the body through the respiratory tract, absorbed across the enormous surface area of the alveoli in the lungs, roughly 70 square meters of membrane across which gas exchange occurs with every breath. The ions interact with the bloodstream, and the mechanism that has received the most rigorous study involves serotonin, the neurotransmitter that regulates mood, sleep, appetite, and the baseline sense of well-being that underlies every waking moment. Serotonin is continuously synthesized and continuously broken down. The enzyme responsible for breaking it down is monoamine oxidase MAO, which cleaves serotonin into an inactive metabolite. The balance between synthesis and degradation determines how much active serotonin is available at any given moment. This is the same balance that SSRI antidepressants target. SSRIs block the reuptake of serotonin into the presynaptic neuron, effectively increasing the amount of serotonin available in the synaptic cleft. They work on the reuptake side of the equation. Negative ions work on the degradation side, reducing MAO activity, which slows the rate at which serotonin is broken down, which extends its active half-life in the synapse. More serotonin persists for longer. The effect is pharmacologically analogous to an antidepressant achieved through a completely different molecular pathway triggered by breathing charged air. Michael Terman at Columbia University tested this directly. In controlled clinical trials published in 1998, Terman exposed subjects with seasonal affective disorder to high-density negative ion environments using calibrated ion generators that replicated the concentrations found near waterfalls. Roughly 10,000 ions per cubic centimeter delivered to the breathing zone. High-density exposure generated antidepressant effects comparable to bright light therapy, the standard treatment for seasonal depression, and to low-dose pharmacological antidepressants. Low-density exposure matching typical indoor air at 100 to 200 ions per cubic centimeter generated no measurable effect. The response was dose-dependent. More ions, more serotonin modulation, more mood improvement. Subjects who received high-density ion treatment for 30 minutes daily showed significant symptom reduction within 2 to 3 weeks, the same timeline that pharmaceutical antidepressants require to reach full therapeutic effect. A 2013 meta-analysis by Perez and colleagues confirmed the finding across multiple studies. The dose threshold fell precisely in the range where outdoor water environments operate and indoor environments do not. Above 5,000 ions per cubic centimeter, the therapeutic effect appeared. Below 1,000, it did not. Put concretely, a person sitting beside a waterfall for 30 minutes is receiving a negative ion dose that clinical trials have shown to be therapeutically effective for depression. The delivery mechanism is breathing. The target is serotonin metabolism. The pathway is MAO inhibition. The person does not need to know any of this for the effect to occur. It operates on every body that breathes the air, regardless of belief, expectation, or awareness of the mechanism. Every waterfall, every ocean shoreline, every mountain stream is a serotonin delivery system. The mountain stream where you stop to rest during a walk is modulating your serotonin metabolism through the electrical charge of the air you breathe while you stand there. The lift you feel, the specific brightening, the sense that the world is slightly more manageable than it was 10 minutes ago, has a biochemical correlate measured in clinical trials and a mechanism traced to enzyme kinetics operating on a neurotransmitter you share with every vertebrate that has ever lived. You have felt this your entire life. The holiday by the coast where you slept deeper, felt calmer, woke more easily because the negative ions were modulating your serotonin around the clock, including through the night if you slept with windows open to the sea air. The afternoon by a river where something in your chest loosened and did not tighten again until you were back in the car driving home where the sealed cabin, the recycled air, the urban acoustic environment gradually reversed every physiological shift the river had initiated. The serotonin modulation was running through all of it silently, beneath the experience you attributed to scenery or the pleasure of being away from work. The broader negative ion literature has been criticized for small sample sizes and inconsistent methodology. The mechanism is still debated. But the clinical data from controlled trials, Terman's dose-dependent results, the Perez meta-analysis confirming the threshold, is consistent. The effect is real at waterfall-level concentrations. Below those concentrations, it disappears. The dose dependence is what separates this from placebo. The dose dependence also explains differences the body registers between water environments. A beach where waves are breaking delivers roughly 20,000 ions per cubic centimeter every wave, a fresh round of Lenard effect electron transfer. A calm harbor delivers 2,000 less turbulence, fewer droplet collisions, fewer ions. The body responds differently to each because the dose is different. Rain generates negative ions throughout its descent, every raindrop shattering on impact, transferring electrons, charging the air. The freshness people smell after a rainstorm, the clean, alive quality of post-storm air that has a name. Petrichor includes a component that is electrical rather than chemical. The ion density after a heavy rain approaches waterfall levels. The air is measurably, electrically different from the air that preceded the storm. Your lungs know this before your conscious mind names it. Now the sound, because the air chemistry is only one channel through which water reaches the nervous system. Moving water generates a specific acoustic signature broadband noise with energy distributed across a wide frequency range, weighted toward lower frequencies. In acoustic physics, this profile is characterized as pink noise, or 1/f noise, a spectrum in which power density decreases proportionally with increasing frequency. Low frequencies carry more energy, high frequencies carry less. The result is a sound that is rich, continuous, and spectrally balanced without the sharp transients, the sudden amplitude spikes, or the information-dense patterns that characterize speech, traffic, or urban environmental noise. How the auditory cortex processes this acoustic profile reveals a fundamental distinction in neural architecture. Speech, music, and alarm signals activate attentional circuits. The brain parses the signal for content, for meaning, for threat. Urban noise traffic, construction. The ambient soundscape of a city contains transient signals the brain must evaluate for potential danger. A horn, a shout, the screech of brakes. Each transient activates threat assessment circuitry, briefly spiking amygdala activity, even when the conscious mind dismisses the sound as irrelevant. The auditory threat system cannot choose to ignore potential danger signals. It evaluates them all. Broadband water noise contains no parsable content. There is no information to extract, no pattern to decode, no threat to evaluate. The auditory cortex receives the signal and, finding no content requiring analysis, passes a safety classification to the amygdala. The amygdala's threat monitoring activity decreases. The prefrontal cortex, which had been maintaining vigilance against potential threat signals in the acoustic environment, disengages from threat monitoring and shifts toward the diffuse, open, attentional state that neuroscientists associate with alpha wave activity. That distinction explains why a person can feel profoundly different after 30 minutes near a river compared to 30 minutes in a park beside a busy road, even if the visual environment is equally green. The visual channel sends similar signals. The acoustic channel sends radically different ones. The park beside the road delivers a continuous stream of transient signals the amygdala must evaluate. The river delivers broadband noise that the amygdala classifies as safe. The nervous system settles near the river because nothing in the acoustic field is asking it to stay alert. Wallace Nichols, a marine biologist who spent a decade surveying the neuroscience of water proximity, documented a consistent EEG finding. Being near, on, or underwater reliably shifts brainwave activity toward alpha wave dominance oscillations in the 8 to 12 Hz range. Alpha waves correspond to a specific mental state: alert but calm, aware but not anxious, attentive without effort. Beta waves, 13 to 30 Hz, dominate during focused analytical work, during worry, during threat assessment. The shift from beta to alpha near water is measurable within minutes of exposure and reverses within minutes of returning to a structured acoustic environment. The broadband water noise, containing no parsable content for the auditory cortex to evaluate, passes a safety classification to the amygdala, which stands down from threat monitoring and allows the cortex to enter the integrative processing state where problems feel smaller and creative connections arrive unbidden. The water is changing the oscillatory state of the cortex, and the changed state generates a different quality of cognition. Two channels in charged air-shifting serotonin, broadband sound-shifting brainwaves. The body has a third response running in parallel, and this is where the cardiovascular measurements become specific. Heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat variation in the intervals between heartbeats, increases within minutes of water proximity. The vagus nerve, which modulates cardiac rhythm through parasympathetic signaling, re-engages as the sympathetic threat response decreases. The heart shifts from the rigid, metronomic beat of a stressed system to the flexible, variable rhythm of a system in recovery. Blood pressure drops. Cortisol concentration in saliva decreases measurable within 20 minutes, continuing to decline for as long as the water exposure persists. Richard Koss at UC Davis isolated the visual channel, specifically testing whether looking at water without breathing its ions or hearing its sound generated measurable autonomic changes. Subjects viewed underwater scenes on screens in controlled laboratory conditions. Heart rate decreased. Blood pressure dropped. Skin conductance, a direct measure of sympathetic activation, fell. The visual image of water, processed through the visual cortex and reaching the amygdala through both the fast subcortical pathway and the slower cortical pathway, was sufficient to initiate parasympathetic re-engagement. The viewer did not need to be near water, they needed to see it. The amygdala's classification operated on visual input alone, recognizing the environmental signal and beginning the autonomic shift before any chemical or acoustic mechanism was available. And it explains something you may have noticed without understanding it: the pull of water in visual media, the screensaver with the tropical ocean, the painting of a river in a waiting room, the window seat chosen for its view of the harbor, the disproportionate time spent watching waves during a beach visit, standing, staring, doing nothing, yet feeling the time is profoundly restful rather than wasted. Each of these is the visual system delivering a water signal to the amygdala, and the amygdala initiating a parasympathetic shift in response. The pull toward the visual is the nervous system seeking the signal. The restfulness of watching is the autonomic system responding to it. Pay attention, the next time you are near water, to what your body does without being asked. The shoulders drop, muscle tension maintained by sympathetic activation, releasing as parasympathetic tone increases. The breathing deepens into the abdomen, the diaphragm, partially inhibited by the shallow breath pattern of the sympathetic state, resuming its full excursion as the vagus nerve re-engages with respiratory control. Each shift is a named autonomic event, occurring without instruction, triggered by the environmental signal the nervous system recognizes as safe. The cumulative experience, what you have always called feeling peaceful near water, is multiple systems shifting simultaneously toward the recovery state the body was calibrated for. The peace is physiology. The cause is the water. Anyone who says, "I feel like a different person when I am near water," is describing something physiologically accurate. They are a different person near water, running a different hormonal profile, a different brainwave pattern, a different autonomic balance, a different immune configuration. The water changes the operating state of every system in the body that has been measured. The person who walks away from the water and slowly returns to their indoor baseline over the following hours is experiencing the reverse, each system reverting as the signals that maintain the shifted state withdraw one by one. One question remains: why? Because the body's response to water is too fast, too consistent, and too independent of individual experience to be learned. It is built in. And the reason it is built in reaches back further than any human memory. This is the mechanism that reframes everything that came before, because it explains why the response exists at all, and it changes the relationship between you and the water from aesthetic preference to biological necessity. Human ancestors spent the overwhelming majority of their evolutionary history near water sources for hundreds of thousands of years before any technology that could transport or store water. Fresh water was the single most critical resource. A human body loses roughly 2.5 liters per day. Cognitive function degrades within hours of depletion. and death from dehydration arrives in 3 to 4 days. Water proximity meant drinking water, food from aquatic organisms and the animals drawn to the source, denser vegetation along riparian corridors, navigable routes through landscape, and defensibility, water on one side reducing the directions from which threats could approach. The selection pressure was absolute. Individuals whose nervous systems drove them toward water survived. Individuals whose nervous systems did not were eliminated. Over hundreds of thousands of generations, the preference was written into the architecture as deep as the preference for warmth, as fundamental as the aversion to heights. That sequence, recognition before awareness, response before decision, is the detail that rewired my thinking about what the body is doing near water. The feeling arrives before the thought because the circuitry that generates it is older than the circuitry that thinks. Why does the amygdala's threat response reduce near water? Because, for most of human evolutionary history, water proximity was the single most reliable indicator that the immediate environment could sustain life. The sound of moving water, that specific broadband acoustic signature, was a signal that the environment was viable. The amygdala learned to classify it as safety. The parasympathetic system learned to engage when it was present. The cortisol system learned to stand down. The entire constellation of physiological changes, the serotonin modulation from negative ions, the alpha wave shift from acoustic processing, the cardiovascular calming from autonomic re-engagement, is the nervous system's deep recognition of an environment it was built for, operating through subcortical circuits, amygdala, hypothalamus, brainstem, autonomic nuclei, that predate the cortical structures responsible for conscious experience by hundreds of millions of years. Anyone who is drawn to water, who chooses the coast for holidays, who always stops at a bridge to look at the river below, who finds something specifically restorative about sitting beside a garden pond on a summer evening, is following an instruction that is older than language, older than culture, older than the species in its current form. The preference was shaped by natural selection, operating over timescales so long that the instruction feels like personality rather than biology. You think you like water because it is beautiful. Your nervous system drives you toward water because, for the vast majority of the time nervous systems have existed, being near water was being safe. The aesthetics arrived later. The survival architecture came first. All of these mechanisms converging: ion chemistry, serotonin modulation, acoustic processing, brainwave shifts, autonomic re-engagement, evolutionary safety signaling, explain something that any single mechanism alone could not: the speed of the response. The feeling near water arrives within seconds. Serotonin modulation through MAO inhibition takes minutes to reach full effect. Alpha wave shifts on EEG appear within 1 to 2 minutes. Heart rate variability changes begin within 5 minutes. But the subjective sense of relief, the chest opening, the breath deepening, arrives almost immediately. The speed suggests that the evolutionary safety signal, the amygdala's pre-conscious classification of the water environment as viable, fires first, initiating the autonomic cascade before any of the chemical or oscillatory mechanisms have fully engaged. The body begins relaxing before the ions have reached the bloodstream, before the alpha waves have displaced the beta, before the cortisol has begun to drop. The relaxation is anticipatory, the nervous system recognizing the environment and initiating the physiological shift based on the recognition alone, with the chemical and acoustic mechanisms deepening the effect over the minutes that follow. This anticipatory response is measurable. Subjects in laboratory studies show heart rate decreases within seconds of viewing water scenes faster than any chemical mechanism could account for. The visual processing of water reaches the amygdala through the fast subcortical pathway, the thalamus to amygdala route, that processes environmental signals in roughly 12 milliseconds, and the amygdala's safety classification initiates parasympathetic engagement before the cortex has fully processed what the eyes are seeing. The body responds to water the way it responds to any deeply encoded survival signal, faster than thought, through circuits that predate conscious awareness, with a reliability that decades of indoor living have not diminished. The body knows before you do. The moment you step onto a beach and something in you exhales before you have taken a breath, the moment you round a bend on a walking path and a river appears below and your shoulders drop before you have consciously registered the view, the moment you open a window and hear rain falling and the quality of the room changes within seconds, something in the body shifts before you have decided to feel anything because the decision was never yours. The shift is the amygdala classifying the environment through circuits that have been making this classification for longer than your species has existed. The mechanisms that follow the ions, the serotonin, the alpha waves, the vagal re-engagement, deepen and sustain what the recognition started. The entire sequence, from first visual contact to full physiological settling, takes roughly 15 to 20 minutes. And it unfolds in a specific order you can track in your own body. The first few seconds are evolutionary recognition, the amygdala classifying the environment, the autonomic system beginning its shift. Over the next 5 minutes, two channels converge. The broadband water noise displaces beta wave dominance and opens the quality of attention, while the cardiovascular system responds in parallel, heart rate variability increasing, blood pressure dropping, the vagus nerve resuming its modulation of cardiac rhythm. By 10 to 15 minutes, the serotonin modulation from the negative ions reaches functional significance, the MAO inhibition, extending serotonin half-life enough to shift baseline mood. The full settling, the deep, sustained calm that arrives after sitting near water for 20 minutes or more is all the mechanisms converging simultaneously in a body that was built over millions of years to function best in exactly this environment. For a person who has spent decades living primarily indoors in air with 100 ions per cubic centimeter, in acoustic environments dominated by structured noise and transient signals, in visual fields containing no water, in a body running low-level sympathetic activation as its default because nothing in the environment triggers the safety signal. The amygdala is waiting for time near water is the condition the nervous system was calibrated for. The indoor environment is the anomaly. The water's edge is the baseline the body was designed to occupy. Consider what this means for the 65-year-old viewer who has spent 40 years working indoors, in offices with recycled air, in homes with sealed windows, in cars on motorways, in supermarkets and waiting rooms and airports. For 40 years, the air has carried 100 ions per cubic centimeter. The acoustic environment has been structured: noise, speech, traffic, appliances, the hum of electronics. The amygdala has received no water safety signal for days, weeks, sometimes months at a time. The sympathetic system has been running low-level activation as its default because the environment never tells it to stand down. The mildly elevated cortisol, the suppressed heart rate variability, the beta wave dominance, the background tension in the jaw and shoulders and chest. This is the physiological cost of living in an environment that never sends the signal. And most people have carried that cost for so long they have forgotten it is there. They think this is what normal feels like. It is what indoor feels like. Normal, the body's actual resting state, the state it was calibrated for, requires the signal. Water sends it. Every time, in every body, through every mechanism the research has measured. Every one of these mechanisms, the ion chemistry, the serotonin modulation, the acoustic processing, the cardiovascular shift, the evolutionary recognition, operates independently of mood, memory, or expectation. The nervous system was calibrated over millions of years in proximity to water, and it responds accordingly. The feeling is not what you bring to the water. It is what the water does to you through the charge of the air, the spectrum of the sound, the recognition encoded in circuits older than the cortex that experiences it. The physics your body has always known.